All right, peace and blessings. It's Saturday, March the 17th, the year 2018. We're going to start at the top of page 51, try to get to the bottom of page 100 on this cesspool of judicial corruption. If I could pay to have a fancy actor read into YouTube, we would do that, but you guys are stuck with me. And so if you want to go read it yourself, you can download the PDF file from Year of Jubilee, JUBILE1E.com. Otherwise, here we go. He made no response nor arranged any meeting. I felt that he ignored the BOP rules and made lame excuses. After a year without any misbehavior, an inmate may possibly make 5 15-minute calls in a month. But frequently those calls are interrupted within seconds. Seldom, if at all, do the guards allow the inmate to reestablish a connection. For example, while calling me and Faye, they cut him off within 30 seconds of making a treasured call. It happened too often, but maybe it wasn't intentional. Prison counselor Richard Madison demanded that David sign over $20 per month from his commissary account. We sent a book, November the 19th, 2005, entitled Betrayed by the Bench, but they refused to give it to David. 1 year later, November the 30th, 2006, they allowed him to make one extra call for the month. But on February the 12th, 2007, he said they allowed no shower, no reason was given. On March the 29th, 2007, David expressed how depressed he is getting. I don't know if I can stand it much longer. Even though they no longer chained him hand and foot whenever they moved him about, he was growing bitter. In the ADX dungeon, here's the way they maintain discipline. In a report written by a staff member of a violation of a rule, he said, on June the 22nd, 2007, SIS staff became aware of a three-way telephone call that had taken place at 7:40 a.m. this date. Hinkson had made a telephone call to his father in Ouray, Colorado. 3 minutes into the call, Hinkson's father verbally stated he would call a third party and get him on the line. At 3:57 into the call, Hinkson got his third party on the line, and Hinkson began speaking with this third party from that point on. That third party was David's attorney, Wes Hoyt. The reason I made the call to Wes while on David's call was due to the fact that the staff at ADX had refused over nearly a month to allow David to notarize a document required by the Supreme Court of Wisconsin in a lawsuit against a shyster lawyer. David responded to the report, which stated as follows: I asked my dad to call the attorney, but I did not ask him to call the attorney while I was on the phone with him. I was talking to my dad on his home phone, and he called the attorney on the speakerphone, cell phone. I could hear my dad talking to the attorney, and I could hear the attorney. I did talk to the attorney too. On line 19, the committee's decision is based upon the following information. Based upon the written report and also in the UDC listening to the recording, the inmate did not ask his father to place a third-party call. But once the father placed a third-party call, the inmate participated in a third-party call by communicating directly with the attorney in this phone call. On line 20, committee action recommendation was removal from K unit in step-down program in J unit of step-down program. In other words, David was to spend another year in solitary confinement. It was signed by UDC Chairman K. Fluck and member Wilma Haygood. This so-called UDC committee report investigation they held in the hallway outside of David's solitary cell. Fluck and Haygood commented to David, "You and your father are stupid." The result of this episode was that for another year, they would move David to a Supermax control unit with fewer phone privileges, to be chained hands and feet even when taken to the 10-minute shower during the one remaining hour of solitary confinement of each 24 hours. Of interest, David learned that Fox News aired an episode, July the 31st, 2007, where high-profile inmates at ADX were playing bingo. This reminds me of the Nazi propaganda during World War II, where the Jews were set up in Fake City for the world to see how humanely they treated their captives, then afterwards took them to the gas chambers. Good press is important to the administrators of BOP facilities. So is BOP's ADX. In fact, as they claim, encouraging inmates to participate in a range of programs that have been proven to reduce recidivism and to help offenders to become law-abiding citizens. Section 10, from my diary. I have maintained a skeletal diary for many years. Life's experience has convinced me that I need to verify meetings, conversations, and events. All too often, misunderstandings or liars challenge my recollections. Keywords and dates jog my subconscious, stimulating my memory. In order to illustrate the pattern of events that took place in David's life over the years, I need only consult my diary. David was born in Artesia, California on July the 18th, 1956. Faye and I had been married since June the 17th, 1954. In order to finance my attendance at law school, I worked throughout the summer break, often for 16 hours per day, and made enough money to carry us through the school year. David often played in the snow on the University of Utah campus, Salt Lake City, Utah. Eisenhower was president. Desegregation was in its infancy, and worldwide the British and French empires were collapsing. Communism was spreading throughout the world. The USSR was losing in Afghanistan. The recession of 1958 was a sharp worldwide economic downturn. It was the worst auto year since World War II. I dropped out of law school. We moved to Compton, California. We made a deposit on a duplex apartment house, and I managed to get a job on the Southern Pacific Railroad as a brakeman and worked out of Northern California. I made enough in 1 month by working 16 hours per day and saving every penny to cover the deposit on the apartment house. By remodeling and adding on, I turned the duplex into a triplex. In addition, I received a scholarship under a Ford Foundation grant to attend the University of Southern California, USC, to become a specialist teacher. At the same time, I was active in politics. During this time, in the fall of 1962, David started kindergarten. I was scoutmaster, and by 1968, David became a first-class scout. Faye and I were making payments for land we had purchased in Ouray, Colorado, a quaint little resort town. Although I was working successfully as a building contractor in Long Beach in the fall of 1970, we moved to Ouray. Richard Nixon succeeded Lyndon Johnson as president about the time we settled. By the time David graduated from high school via a GED from Western State in January of 1973, President Nixon had resigned from the presidency, and Gerald Ford finished Nixon's term as president. 1 year later, on January 1st, 1974, during the Vietnam War, David, at age 17, joined the U.S. Navy. While in the Navy, he worked as a helicopter mechanic. He graduated from the Naval Air Technical Training Center, Millington, Tennessee Jet Engine Repair School on August 6, 1974, and was discharged from the Navy December 17, 1976. He also became a certified welder. David later went to Ricks College in Rexburg, Idaho, renamed BYU Ricks, and later to Dixie College in southern Utah. On May the 5th, 1976, the Teton Dam broke. David came home to Ouray with 4 snowmobiles he bought that he salvaged from the Teton Dam flood in Idaho. He was very proficient as a mechanic, could fix nearly anything. On December the 15th, 1979, he married Marta Marie Clark. We gave them a job running a care home we owned. Next, he attended the University of Colorado at Boulder, Colorado, and received a GRI certificate in real estate. He became a licensed Colorado and Utah real estate broker December 1981, an escrow agent, and in addition, he became an insurance broker in both Idaho and Nevada. During this time, a severe recession in the United States began in July of 1981 and did not end until November 1982. Ronald Reagan was president, yet in Ouray, we had been suffering even earlier and later from our local recession. Some economists believe that the primary cause of the recession was a contractionary monetary policy established by the Federal Reserve System to control high inflation. David and Marie thought they could do better elsewhere, so after 1 year, they moved to Provo, Utah, December 26, 1980. They moved next to Las Vegas in 1982, bought and sold real estate, operated 3 dry cleaning stores, and handled cleaning and laundry for casinos. During this time, David's younger brother, Gary Michael, was killed in Ouray, August 5, 1982, in his 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner sports car that he had just overhauled. Times were tough for me and Faye. Also, for a couple of years, I traveled back and forth bi-weekly from Ouray to Las Vegas, Nevada. I joined a real estate firm as a broker in Las Vegas and then opened my own real estate office. We had acquired 20 rundown apartment units in Las Vegas, but even Las Vegas was struggling. It was not an easy time in 1984 for David to bring his family to Vegas, but there was more money there than he had seen anywhere in our vicinity. I helped David get accounts with the larger casinos to launder their bedspreads. He met people easily. He had an uncanny ability to meet people. He was totally uninhibited. I would put him on the phone talking to mortgage brokers. We were looking for real estate options or whatever. Protocol is not in David's vocabulary. He would talk to rich or powerful people as though they were just other kids on the block. George Mitzel is a good example. David introduced me to George on February the 15th, 1984. George had been a multimillionaire but built the Castaways Casino on the Las Vegas Strip nearly all out of pocket. The $400 million Mirage Hotel now stands on the same site. George had bought 20% of a 950-acre tract of land called the Valley Wells Ranch. It's a long story how things ended. However, David, George, and I acquired the Plaza Quality Cleaners in 1985, but that venture failed. Faye and I made the decision to either both move to Las Vegas permanently or try to make a go of Ouray. We stayed in Ouray even though in Las Vegas financial prospects were looking very promising. In Ouray, we turned our large 7,000 square foot home into an alternative care facility. We later increased the size to 10,000 square feet. David continued to manage our apartments and he tried other ventures. In April 1985, he started manufacturing soap that failed. Then he bought an auto garage with all the tools. David could fix anything, but he didn't understand people. The people he trusted just stole his shop full of tools. On September the 1st, 1985, David called me saying, "Dad, I'm flat broke. I have $1 to my name." He closed the garage the next month. On October the 12th, 1985, and said he's going to go back to school, but didn't. He did manage to keep some bedspread accounts, though. Yet on April the 12th, 1986, he called me again saying, "I lost the Tropicana account. We don't have any money." What David had learned about Las Vegas real estate turned him in a new direction. He bought a home for $129,000 with nothing down. On October the 18th, 1986, he started working a new job installing elevators. Politics was involved, and David quit because of the union intrigue. It seems that David can do anything if he sets his mind to it, except he can't judge character or social complexities. It didn't take David long to figure out another possibility. He located 5 acres of real estate outside the city limits of Las Vegas. He made a deal with a man who was dying of AIDS. The deal was that David would pay $15,000 in cash. He used creative financing, borrowing $30,000 from an equity lender to finish improvements for water, power, and septic. David then made a deal on March 18, 1987 to buy a livable 70 by 14 mobile home for $10,000 cash. By March 28, 1987, he had both land and a house for his family. Sadly, just 2 months later, David's newborn baby, Ashley, died. The family buried her with her Uncle Gary in Ouray. David fought on, clearing land, digging trenches, drilling for water, and fighting local bureaucracy. The BLM granted an easement across federal property to unlock his landlocked property. By February 1988, David and family were still living hand-to-mouth. In August 1988, David initiated a new pursuit import-export. He connected with an experienced promoter who turned out to be dishonest. Interesting events occurred. But by the end of March 1989, David was no longer in the import-export business. That romance was over. Yet something good came from this relationship. He met a prominent attorney, George Grizzotti of the law firm Grizzotti and Cantor in Las Vegas. David built and networked the law firm's computer system. George took David under his wing. George was a punctilious man with an impressive office complex over the Valley Bank building. David had done him an unexpected service. George was grateful, but I think puzzled. Anyway, George had an air conditioning problem at his home and asked David if he'd look at it. "No problem," David said, and it wasn't for David. George recognized a talent in David. Before long, David started studying law and became a paralegal, working part-time in the firm, writing legal briefs and doing pro bono research. He would plop himself in Mr. Grizzotti's complex in an unspecified area and would designate it as his new office. George was prim and proper, well-groomed and masterful. David, by contrast, would walk into George's office, shirt tail hanging out, and sit on the edge of George's large oak desk, and their friendship continues. In 1988, David successfully cured himself in what he believes was a cancer. He used an herbal formula used by the Indians. He said, "I got the formula and shared it with many people. I've worked on many things in the area of energy, health, and physics that I would like to share, but time restraints prevented me from achieving many of my goals." During the month of August 1990, hostilities between the United States and Iraq began heating up. Iraq annexed Kuwait on the 8th of August. David called me about a month later on September the 25th, 1990. He told me about an opportunity that I should look into to acquire a telephone switch, a large-scale computer used to route telephone calls in a central office. We met with the company president, worked out the details, but the company's board of directors chose a different path. This was volatile time for America. In 1990, David made a little money here and there, just enough to get by. The Cold War had ended, but on January 16, 1991, President George Herbert Walker Bush announced the beginning of the Gulf War and called up the reserves. The Navy did not call up David for that war. During this time, David was still searching for the hidden combination to unlock his success. More problems, but then he clicked. Persistent, successful people try, experiment, but never give up. The sun also rises. Section 11. David hits the jackpot, finally. Seems that everything he tried failed one way or another. By 1991, he was still dabbling with a telephone company deal, and he didn't get his first check until December 22nd. But by November, he was in a dispute with Clark County over his water well, where his house trailer was located. Also, he was still trying to resolve a dispute with the federal government over ownership of water at the Valley Wells Ranch. All was time-consuming and unprofitable. In January of 1992, a close friend of David's, Dale Hunt, got him a job as a doorman at the Las Vegas Tropicana Hotel. This night job put food on the table and left David time to pursue his interest. He never relented on attacking and exposing what he recognized as government fraud. By July, David was in full swing and was becoming a real nuisance to politicians such as Harry Reid. He bought a small printing press and then printed about 600,000 plus leaflets. He organized volunteers from veterans of foreign wars to pass out these revealing flyers. This led on January 7th, 1993, to an investigation to go on the invitation to go on the Lou Epton radio show. David became Lou's most popular guest and was on the air as much as 3 times a week. He had plenty to say about the Bureau of Land Management, Nature Conservancy, crooked politicians in Clark County, and the Nevada state government. By May, Clark County sued him, but he countersued. David, now armed with knowledge of the law, became an irritating opponent. The court postponed a trial set for June the 20th to a later date. David eventually won his countersuit, but a judge's order stymied him. In September, David quit his job at the Tropicana to move to Idaho. By November of 1993, David had researched how to manufacture ozone generators at a much cheaper cost than those offered in the marketplace, mostly by doctors. He called his new machine a spa ozonator. He named his company Water Oz. The name combined the terms water and ozone. David came up with another idea. He said, "I discovered a new type of heating systems that creates a byproduct from an unused gas, and the cost to run it is very low. This is a new type of gas that implodes." I started producing a colloidal mineral product and later upgraded to a new technology which I developed to produce mineral products in a solution. As though this wasn't enough, he came up with other concepts. I discovered a new way to make minerals without using electricity or heat. Also, I developed a cold plasma energy system called REEC, R-E-E-C, Radiant Energy Electrical Conversion. An excerpt from his papers illustrates the depth of his thinking. He wrote Einstein's unified field theory, see davidhinkson.info, on radiant energy. He says, "The theory, when an object is radioactive, the radiant energy which is emitted is similar to sunlight in the respect that if sunlight hits an object, the target and the light source is shut off, the object does not continue to radiate sunlight. When a target is radiated with radiant energy and the radiant energy source is shut off, the target does not continue to emit radiant energy. It does not retain radiant energy. It has been radiated. When a lead wall is put up between the radiant source and an object of the source is shut off, and the target has no or limited residual effect. Example, when welders want to test the integrity of their welds, they often X-ray the welds using radiant energy from a nuclear source, which is contained in the lead. The radiant energy showers the welded metal. The image shows up on the film, which was placed behind the steel. After the process is over, the steel is not radioactive, but it has been radiated. This nuclear reek device converts radiant energy from nuclear waste directly into AC current. This nuclear battery is small and creates a huge amount of electrical current without using fusion. He then promoted his products on the radio. Next, he started his own global radio network over shortwave radio, and he broadcasted locally. Sales were growing. He hired a local handicapped couple, Phil Kofall, nicknamed Goose, and his wife Stacy. For security, they moved their house trailer onto BLM land next to David's property. They lived rent-free. Stacy learned how to assemble ozone gas-producing air purifiers, for which David paid $25 per unit, and with Goose's help, they were able to assemble as many as 100 units per week. They made upwards of $10,000 per month. The area turned into something that looked like a gypsy camp. They made more money than ever before in their lives. David sued the Clark County Commissioners on November the 24th. By June of 1994, he filed his brief against the federal government. On radio and as an invited speaker at assemblies, he accused the federal government of fraud, deception, and treason. 1 year later, December 1995, he bought land in Idaho, started building a home and 10,000 square foot building near Grangeville, Idaho. But no good deed ever goes unpunished. Greedy and lazy, low-life people would rather steal from the honest, but they breathe the same air as the producers. Section 12. Swisher's blackmail begins. On July the 19th, 2001, I called Britt Groom, as mentioned earlier, to tell him that Joe Swisher is a liar and a thief. Joe and his wife Barbara had been guests in our home just days before I called Britt. At that time, David had only known Swisher for about 6 months. I told David not to have anything to do with this guy, but Jerry Gray wanted Swisher to continue doing the analysis because Jerry maintained that no one else was qualified. David tolerated the situation with Swisher until January the 3rd, 2003, when things came to a head. Greg Towerton called to tell me that Swisher plans to sue David and Waterose. This was no surprise, because Britt Groom had previously warned me that if I didn't pay Swisher $5,000, he would testify against David. Next day, January 4th, Swisher called. He said, "Give me 50% of Waterose or I'll testify in the tax case about the cyanide." He claimed that his testing showed there was cyanide in some of the products tested. Waterose does not add cyanide to any product, yet Swisher does use cyanide for his testing at his house. David immediately announced over the factory loudspeaker, "Joe Swisher is trying to blackmail me." After that, David would not even talk to Swisher. David had previously sent Lonnie Birmingham, an employee whom David had trained to make the minerals, to Swisher's house after November 21st, 2002 raid. The reason was David thought Chris Patriot sabotaged the labels. David, as well as everyone else, was confused and uncertain about what to do about all this intrigue. Bellin had told David that David, needed Joe Swisher as a witness and that Swisher needed access to the factory. However, when Swisher did come to the factory, Cindy told him, "You have no business here." "I beg your pardon," Swisher said, but Swisher did gain access and had an unsupervised reign of the factory. "Once we uncover the nesting place of vermin, we choke on their stench, while the stench turns our stomachs. Under which rocks can we find such people?" Section 13. Who is this guy Swisher? A former close friend of Swisher's, Joel Volk, didn't believe at first that Swisher is a fraud. Swisher was commandment of the local Marine Corps League unit. The other members were proud to have such a combat veteran like Swisher as their chief. Mr. Volk was a former active member of the United States Marine Corps and a member of the National Marine Corps League until an accident with Commandant Elvin Joe Swisher. Joe Volk and his wife Barb shared celebrations of the 4th of July or on other occasional events with Joe Swisher and his wife Barbara. Volk was an authentic combat veteran who had fought in Vietnam with Mike Clausen, his honored friend. Joel Volk introduced Swisher to Mike. Swisher followed up his contact seeking Clausen's and Volk's help with regards to veteran administration benefits. In an affidavit concerning Mike Clausen, Joel Volk testifies, Clausen earned the Medal of Honor as a result of January 31st, 1970 incident in a minefield outside Da Nang, Vietnam, rescuing 18 fallen soldiers during Operation Kingfisher, in which I participated as a member of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion Marines. On that day, Clausen walked through the tall grass in this minefield with a helicopter nearby, and at the peril of his own life, physically carried 18 wounded U.S. servicemen to the chopper. The men were spread out over the minefield, and they were taking enemy ground fire. During his 4-year tour of duty, Clausen received a total of 113 commendations and medals for his numerous acts of bravery and distinguished service, in addition to the Medal of Honor. Swisher borrowed a copy of Clausen's information about the replacement Medal of Honor awarded to Clausen by President Richard M. Nixon, so that he, Swisher, could use that information as a template for the creation of Swisher's forged replacement DD-214. Swisher used information of Clausen's to present to various courts and governmental officials, and which was used by him to bestow the honor due to distinguished service veterans upon himself. By contrast, Swisher, with his fictitious stories of valor, was able to obtain the Clausen information that helped Swisher manufacture his own fictitious claims of valor using the facts from true stories of real combat heroes such as Clausen. Swisher learned from Clausen that most highly respected hero was the one who rescued American soldiers. So when Swisher manufactured his story, he weaved his plot around a rescue operation involving supposed American-Korean War prisoner of wars in order to engender greater empathy. Later, as we unravel the story, the appellate judges, in reviewing the record in David's case, struggled with various issues. In the first written appellate opinion, the two majority judges marveled at Judge Talman's statement that a quick review of the file indicates that Mr. Swisher was, in fact, involved in top-secret activities. The judges said, "We were somewhat surprised in view of the contents of the file." The opinion continued. Outside the presence of the jury, the court, Talman, told counsel Noland and Hoyt that it would conduct a more thorough review of the file over the weekend. When the trial reconvened on Monday, January the 24th, the court discussed Swisher's official military file with counsel off the record. Then on the record, and without the jury present, the court stated its conclusions. The court stated that the file had been sent in response to the court's subpoena to the National Personnel Records Center. The irrefutable authority and the Dowling letter concluded that the replacement DD-214 and the supporting letter purportedly signed by Woodring were not authentic. They were, in fact, fake, a fraud. But the court, Talman, stated that he found the file very difficult to decipher. Talman had said, "It is not at all clear to me what the truth of the matter is." He said that the problem he had in reviewing the documents in private chambers is that the documents we have themselves are neither self-authenticating nor self-explanatory. I have no idea if somebody is involved in secret military operations or whether or not their personnel file would ever reflect those missions. His determination to support the federal prosecutors and to convict David overpowered any common sense. The final authority on document verification is the National Personnel Records Center. His feeble attempt to fantasize the obvious was beyond pathetic. We have a signed affidavit from a witness who inadvertently caught Swisher during the trial departing from Judge Talman's office. Obviously, Talman denies... Obviously, Talman prostituted his office as an unbiased appellate court judge and is simply a liar. Judge Talman denied David's motion for a new trial. Certainly, Talman had to know better. If he ruled according to the absolute evidence, David would likely have walked a free man. Talman chose to lie. He gave several reasons for declining to grant a new trial on the basis of David's newly discovered evidence, that Swisher's documents were forgeries, etc. Talman had grasped for straws in order to support his former colleagues, the federal prosecutors. The appellate judges point out that the court, Talman, concluded that Hinkson had not been diligent in seeking the evidence he now submitted to the court. Second, the court concluded that the evidence was not newly discovered, because the substance of both proffered documents is not new and is generally cumulative of previously available information. Finally, most importantly, the court concluded that the proffered new evidence is not material to the issue at trial. What utter nonsense. What we just read was that David's attorney were not diligent, that timing at trial is more important than a man's life, and that the testimony of a pathological liar is not material to a defendant's case. On April the 22nd, 2005, Judge Talman denied David a new trial and continued to rule that Swisher may have really been involved in secret operations as he had testified, regardless of the screaming evidence. Talman's opinion reflects a belief that Swisher's testimony is at least equal to the official records of the National Personal Records Center and of the United States Marine Corps. And unless David can show that Swisher's testimony is absolutely false, and David can't prove his innocence, he surely must be guilty and must spend the rest of his life in prison. Based on Swisher's insightful and honest encounters with David, we must not question any of Swisher's testimony. The Justice Department, and some within the judiciary, is more concerned with who wins in a contest than who is innocent or guilty. Can one person launch a ship into a cesspool sea that destroys anyone in its path? Let's see. Let me read that again. Can one person launch a ship into a cesspool sea that destroys anyone in its path? Let's see. Section 14. How and when did this all begin? In 2000, former Idaho County Prosecuting Attorney, PA, Dennis Albers, was again running for re-election. The Idaho Supreme Court ordered him never seek that office again because of his corrupt performance in the 1980 trial involving one Elvin Joe Swisher, who later became the government's star witness against David. David had learned that the Idaho Supreme Court permanently barred this prosecutor from ever running for the prosecutor's office again and used the information to oppose the election of Albers as the Idaho County Prosecuting Attorney. Unfortunately, David had a run-in with Albers over a case where a non-employee sued David for half of his business. The case resulted in David having to pay over $100,000 in damages and create some bad blood between David and Albers. Annette Hasselone, a former employee of Water Oz, who later admitted she stole David's formulas, had also stolen his product promotion tape and gave it to Dr. Joel Swisher, no relation to Elvin Joe Swisher. He plagiarized the tape for a company called Eniva, E-N-I-V-A. He died a couple of days later. But Annette Hasselone ultimately sued Eniva for firing her once they learned of her incompetence. She admitted in their trial that she stole David's trade secrets to promote Eniva products. David's product marketing information helped Eniva immediately grow from marginal sales into $1 million per month. Only because of the suit did Annette admit her theft. She even testified in court that she had taken David's trade secrets and sold them to Eniva. During the election campaign, David sent out 10,000 letters to the voters in Idaho County reciting the fact that Albers had been admonished by the Idaho Supreme Court never to seek election as the prosecuting attorney again. The reason for the restriction was Albers' past serious ethics violation in speaking to a jury during the 1980 criminal trial against Joe Swisher. Albers was soundly defeated, crestfallen from the loss of an assured victory, and he swore to take it out on Hinkson, which he did. "You belong in jail, and I'll put you there and take your business," Albers swore. Thereupon, Albers orchestrated an unrelenting attack on David by conspiring with others, including the woman Annette Hasselone, who claimed she had once been a Water Oz employee. Ironically, the dietary supplement products which David had invented, including ionized metals such as silver, gold, zinc, and copper, all helped this woman recover from a serious illness, a lung infection, which nearly took her life. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. So she, along with others, proceeded with their attempts to destroy David and steal his business. Jody Walker of the Lewiston Tribune reported that Dennis Albers, the feds, and court records were her major source of negative information on David. When Jody revealed her news source to Linda Duran by saying that Albers had much more information about David than had been printed in her newspaper, Attorney Hoyt declared she waived her First Amendment newspaper reporter privileges. It also confirmed that Albers was behind the scenes stirring the pot as one of her major sources of information. Albers was the district attorney in Grangeville during the Joe Swisher trial in the 1980s for allegations of Swisher raping, over a 10-year period, all 4 of his daughters. Albers spoke to one of the jurors during the trial, while passing time during a recess. That conversation caused a mistrial. Neither Albers nor any other justice entity ever pursued the charges. The Idaho Supreme Court castigated Albers by informing him that he could never hold public office again, which he later ignored. One of the Swisher's daughters testified years later about her agony. She was fearful of possible retaliatory acts by her father. David paid over $6,000 to print and mail a letter exposing Albers' past deeds to every voter in Idaho County. Polls indicated that Albers had a 30% lead. When David's letters arrived in the mailboxes of voters the day before the election, Albers lost by minus 30%. Albers swore he'd get even. "I'll put you in jail and get your business," he threatened. He made good on the threat. A prosecuting attorney has absolute unfettered control of all criminal cases. He can file or not file, he can dismiss at will, and there is no one who can question him. After all, David cost Albers a $60,000 a year job, as I recall, for the 4-year term, and since he planned to retire thereafter, he lost a lifetime pension. But now we understand that a deal was later made so that Albers, as a deputy prosecutor, will be able to put in the additional years needed to fully fund and receive his PERA retirement. Dennis Albers and employees of Water Oz, Dan Gatney and Phil Kofal, an independent contractor, began supplying false information to IRS agent Gerald Vernon, alias Morgan, and IRS agent Stephen Hines about David being the head of 2 militias, storing sniper rifles, machine guns, and 100-pound bags of gunpowder in the factory, about making threats against various people, etc. From other evidence, it is clear that Albers is one of the key individuals who started the rumors, but he hid behind others as fall guys to blame for his source of information. Agent Vernon, who had worked closely with Albers when Annette Hasselone first started her campaign against David, sent the same type of information to the Idaho Department of Labor. Working together, these collaborators corroborated each other's stories and painted a picture, making David look like an extremely dangerous cult terrorist leader. There was a woman named Mariana Raff, a pathological liar, who had stolen $6,600 cash from David. She worked as his housekeeper for a time and learned where David kept his money. Further, Mariana helped her family members steal over $80,000 from David in a Mexican real estate purchase scam. Part of the motivation for Mariana to lie against David was that she recognized that with David in jail, neither this woman nor her family would be accountable or responsible for the stolen funds. Hold on. The government finally had to admit their knowledge of the fraudulent stories manufactured by Miss Raff with the help of the FBI when her credibility was finally destroyed by repeated criminal acts she committed, such as burglarizing a drugstore and a post office, to mention a few of her crimes. There is an expression, "Hell has no fury like a woman scorned," but it is equally true of men with power. Section 15, Albers expands his intrigue. In 2000, Albers attempted to recruit former Water Oz employee Stephen Bernard as a plaintiff to file suit against David for claims similar to those brought by Annette Hasselone. Albers suggested that Bernard could expect to collect an award of around $100,000 and that he, Albers, would take the case on a contingency fee basis. Bernard flatly turned Albers down. He testified that Albers said he wanted to have Mr. Hinkson charged with murder for hire and put in jail for the rest of his life. However, Albers continued to spread false stories against David, including 404B, evidence that the government used about an alleged plot that David wanted to kill him. David is confident that Dennis Albers and Annette Hasselone cooked up the lost wages scheme as a backup just in case a jury didn't buy Annette's story. There is now speculation by some that Albers may have taken a bribe to throw the case for Joe Swisher. Excuse me. Joe openly brags about having large amounts of gold from his mining operation that he smelts down to gold bars. It's all untraceable. Others recruited into the scam were Kevin Hagan. He admitted that Annette Hasselone's mother-in-law, Bobby Eve, had hidden Annette's payroll records. He supposedly was offered money by David to kill the convicted felon Mark Eve and his nefarious wife, Annette Hasselone Eve. Added to the list were Albers, Judge Lodge, and IRS agent Steve Hines. Another recruit was Mariana Raff, who supposedly told Albers that Dave tried to hire her Mexican brothers to kill Albers. Kevin claims that while at Dennis Albers' office, he told Dennis that David had offered him money to kill Albers and that David had lots of automatic or semi-automatic rifles at the factory. He related that when the government asked him if Hinkson had ever tried to hire him or kill Albers, he said, yeah, because as Lonnie Birmingham had said, he did not know what else to do and that Hinkson had always talked crazy stuff about Albers anyway. As an inter-office memo at the Idaho Department of Labor, IDLE, in early 2000, identified Jody Walker of the Tribune with having informed the regional director Linda Duran that according to Albers, Hinkson was a dangerous person. Thus, Albers, with the assistance of his close ally and shirt-tail relative Jody Walker, was able to build throughout Idaho County and beyond a negative image of David. Agents Vernon and Hines, after March of 2000, pursued their endeavor to indict David by using fraudulent administrative summonses to obtain his financial records without allowing him the time as required by law to answer the summons. As an example, Albers turned over David's financial records as he had obtained in discovery in the Hasselone versus Hinkson case to IRS agents Vernon and Hines. He immediately turned them over when presented with a summons without giving David time to object. Vernon said that he faxed the summons to Albers. Albers immediately released the Hinkson financial records to Vernon. Regardless, David had no chance to object. Dan Gotney betrayed David also in other ways. In a hunting accident where his nephew shot him in the foot, David compassionately paid his wages when he couldn't work. Once out of the hospital, Gotney returned to the factory. Dave created another job that allowed Dan to sit at the shipping computer at Waterose doing very little work but drawing his full pay. He had recovered to the point where working in shipping he was interacting with the UPS delivery man. The UPS driver saw Dan loading customer-returned air purifiers directly into his vehicle. The driver reported this to the company. Dan was taking home the customer-returned items for parts. He disassembled them using the parts to create new units for sale to enrich himself. Tracy Adams and Debbie Morley, employees of Waterose, had worked for Asker's grocery store in Grangeville with Dan. Tracy says Dan thought of himself as a ladies' man and was always hitting on someone. Tracy knew Gotney's wife, Judy. Tracy believed they were good friends. When Tracy visited Judy, Tracy stated that she saw as many as 5 Waterose ozonators, air purifiers, assembled by Gotney from parts he had stolen from air purifiers that customers had returned. Other Waterose employees observed Dan at the factory coming in early and copying files. Gotney admitted to Tracy, "I've been taking records from Waterose so that if Dave ever fires me or does me wrong, I can get him." Of course, law enforcement never resolved or even considered the unauthorized copying of Waterose files. After learning of Dan's thefts, Waterose fired Gotney, and Tracy acknowledged that the company fired him for his thefts and dishonesty. The conspiracy to destroy David grew to new dimensions. Annette Hasselone now recruited Dan, who already wanted to get even with David, to join with her and Albers. Then she and Dan approached Steve Bernard and told him they were working together to get Hinkson. "I'm going to bring him and his factory down," Gotney said after being fired. Debbie Morley testifies that Gotney and Hasselone were working together. Gotney's shadowy scheme prevented Waterose from being able to properly adjust customers' accounts because without recording the returned item, there was no tracking mechanism. So the customer's warranty was not honored and no replacement unit was sent out. Tracy witnessed the misconduct of Annette Hasselone, Steve Bernard, and Dan Gotney as each attempted, through intimidation, to obtain an ownership percentage interest in Waterose. Gotney wanted a portion on the air purifier business. Of course, Annette wants a lion's share of the company. Steve Bernard stepped into the muck, then bailed. But according to Tracy, he had approached her to help him and Dan Gotney bring down David Hinkson. What really bothered Debbie Morley mostly was after all the help David gave Dan while in the hospital and afterwards while rehabilitating, she remembers Dan saying, "I'm going to bring Dave and his factory down." David had only one meeting with Joe Swisher at Swisher's house or garage laboratory in Cottonwood, Idaho. This was David's one and only time to step foot in Swisher's house. It occurred immediately after the FBI SWAT team raid on November the 21st, 2002. Swisher was in a wheelchair with an exposed catheter dangling. Lonnie Birmingham accompanied David on that trip. The purpose of that meeting was to get an affidavit that David had prepared for Swisher to sign, blaming Chris John Patriot Carl Waterman for the mislabeling of the Water Oz products. The affidavit blamed Chris for all the parts per million label problems as an FDA issue because Chris was an easy scapegoat as he had disappeared a few days before the raid. He likely had been informed by federal officials that a raid was about to take place. Chris was the first person David trained and that had learned David's trade secrets, proprietary formulas. The second person David trained to oversee the actual manufacturing process of the mineral supplements was Lonnie Birmingham. David and Lonnie prepared a sample of each product made by Chris Patriot that he calibrated and could see that all of the Water Oz products someone in fact mislabeled or the products were deficient. Consequently, Swisher agreed to sign David's affidavit blaming Chris for the parts per million labeling discrepancy. But later, Dave found out that Chris had not processed the potassium long enough, which was the reason that the pH level had not dropped sufficiently. Probably because Chris fled the factory a few days before the raid, David thinks that Chris is a federal agent and a rat. Regardless, Dave knew that either Patriot or Joe Swisher were responsible for reporting incorrect product content. Chris mysteriously left Water Oz days before the raid. Then he returned and then left again. After a later event, the Bellin takeover, Dave filed a missing persons report on him. Curiously, when Chris came back, he asked David to sign over a car title. David had generously assisted this man in acquiring a car. David learned of Chris' true colors. A loyal and trusted employee warned David, "Many of your workers, such as Chris Patriot, are informers." Of course, Swisher accused the Water Oz mineral maker, Chris Patriot. He said Chris had poisoned the product, but the pH of 10 was wrong. For this accusation to stand, Chris would have had to prepare special batches of each product for Swisher's testing, each of which was perfectly in spec without the labeling. With the labeling. Each of which was perfectly in spec with the labeling. If it were Patriot who was the villain, he would have had to dilute the product before it was bottled, and after testing samples, he would have had to add more distilled water to the tank, or to have amplified the samples by adding more concentrate, so that it tested correctly. Obviously, it was Swisher, the professed mining engineer, who provided the false test result showing that the parts per million content of all the Water Oz products were consistent with the parts per million on the labels when they were not. Attorney Groom convinced David to plead guilty to mislabeling the product, even though David had done nothing wrong. But he had little choice but to plead guilty because he was the ultimate person in charge. Thus, David pled guilty to a crime created or committed by Swisher when David had relied on Swisher's test results that his products were in compliance. The handicapped couple, Phil Kofal, known as Goose, and Stacy, who had lived on David's property in Las Vegas, followed David to Idaho since they had been making more money from David than ever before in their lives. David paid them cash because he knew that they could not have survived without regular wages. David had invited them to join him when he moved his operation to Idaho County in 1997. They were among the first people to be associated with David in his new business, but it didn't take too long for them to want more than just a job building ozonators on a piece-by-piece basis. Actually, Stacy Kofal assembled the ozonator machines. Maybe because of seniority, they felt entitled to some of David's soaring business. Goose participated with a small group in the first of a long series of attempted takeovers, but David put a stop to that conspiracy. Phil then began stealing equipment and supplies from Water Oz, such as fencing material, which he gave to a friend in Kuskia, a nearby town in Idaho. Bill Rich, David's friend and Water Oz customer, early one morning caught Kofal loading supplies into the trunk of his car. He reported it to David. After the preceding attempted takeover, David viewed this theft as the last straw and fired Stacy and David, said that Goose technically had never worked for Water Oz. Goose was now ripe for joining the other conspirators associated with Albers. Annette Hasselone may have been the one to recruit Goose. The Kofals now claim that they followed Hinkson to Grangeville, Idaho, because David offered to give them approximately 200 of his 300 acres of land in exchange for their labor. Goose had been spreading rumors concerning David being a militiaman. Over time, the ripening process heightened. In a telephone interview 2 years later, on February 16, 2000, Goose told IRS agent Vernon that David was affiliated with a militia leader from Portland named Bill Rich. Rich, now deceased, was a member government-sponsored citizens militia in Portland, Oregon. Bill Rich had on occasion discussed the subject of militias openly at Water Oz, but Phil Kofal and Dan Gautney and like-minded people spread the idea in a negative way. They tried to use it against Dave, claiming that he was the head of 2 illegal militias. Kofal states that he witnessed Mr. Rich delivering several assault rifles, dozens of high-capacity magazines, crates of ammunition, and night vision gear. However, Bill Rich, when interviewed by authorities, confirmed that he never possessed assault rifle ammunition or night vision gear. Kofal claimed that he saw several of Hinkson's rifles, including an HK MP5 that looked like British Sten guns, which do not exist. Of course, no one else corroborated his story because no one else ever saw his fictitious cache of weapons. Even the feds ignored the accusations. When I removed David's gun collection from a locked cabinet, I found his BB gun, a .22 caliber rifle, and a hunting rifle. His .45 caliber pistol was stolen. We have reason to believe who is the thief, a former employee. Goose said he feared that David would retaliate against him for his exposure revelations shared with the IRS and FBI, so he asked to have his name kept confidential. IRS agent Vernon, alias Morgan, reported that when he asked Kofal why he feared Hinkson, Goose reported to him that Hinkson was closely affiliated with the Minutemen and Montana militias, and that many of his employees were also members of the militia movement, that David would have one of his followers perform violent acts. Goose was confident that if he could report any IRS reporting failures by David, he stood to collect a substantial reward. He filed IRS Form 211 and Form 2662, then waited for the slot machine to pay off. Agent Vernon reported, however, that the reason Kofal is informing on Hinkson is that he believes that Hinkson sells a dangerous product, and that he is also bitter about Hinkson's refusal to pay the Kofals for services they performed. Goose alleged that David's profit margin at Water Oz is enormous, and that the major cost of packaging, that the cost of producing a gallon of product is 30 cents, and that the gallon of container sells for $30 to $40, a preposterous speculation from a man devoid of any business knowledge or sense. He also stated that David gave a party where he celebrated his first million gross income. Goose testified to Vernon that he knows that Hinkson has a bank account in Belize, both under his own name and that of his father, Roland Hinkson. I wish I knew where such a bank account exists. We certainly could have used the money in David's defense. Kofal's venom was unceasing. He stated that David produced audio tapes on his radio talk show on topics such as how to beat the IRS. He accused Water Oz of selling products that caused a customer's death. He latched onto anything his imagination could conceive, then stated it as fact. Even though the statements proved groundless, the government officials never challenged them. Rather, the government incorporated even the most preposterous statements incorporated in their case against David. After all, the goal was to get a conviction, not to learn the truth. Phil Kofal, Goose, died May 27, 2003 of cardiorespiratory arrest, secondary to lung cancer. Jerry Gray, David's close friend, took a vacation with Annette Hasselone, went to Las Vegas, and drove to Pahrump, Nevada. Speculation has it she met with Stacy, the widow of Goose Kofal, who moved to Pahrump. Stacy became, as of December the 26th, 1998, the beneficiary of the reward for turning David over to the IRS. Some people are willing to sell their souls for pocket change. One must take pity on these types. They failed to learn that anything worth having is worth working for, not worth stealing for. Chapter 16, Other Employee Betrayers. Later, others saw an opportunity to extract money from David while he was down. Fast Buck Chuck, one of David's former employees, had a reputation of suing anyone at the drop of a hat. Charles Chuck Cohagen, a man in his 50s, thought of himself as a militiaman. He often talked loudly to customers about guns. He bragged he had read books on poison quills, hand-to-hand combat, and how to protect himself from the government. Tracy Adams knew Charles and Jody Cohagen quite well. She also knew that no militia groups came to the factory or met at the factory, although Chuck would try to impress others with his bravado. He never showed anyone at the factory any guns or poison quills. Chuck's bad temper was quite often unleashed on his wife Judy. She also worked at Waterause in shipping. Chuck's favored way of confronting someone, including Judy, who would just cry, was to point his finger into a person's face while yelling at her or him, violating the individual's personal space. This was especially true with female employees, such as no-nonsense Debbie Morley, who simply brushed his hand away. Lonnie Birmingham lived next door to Judy and Chuck. He provided transportation for Judy to the Waterause factory at the times when Chuck was abusive to her, which was at least once a week. However, in August or September 2003, when Chuck really needed an attorney to help him, as his marriage was falling apart, he went to Dennis Albers. Lonnie had become more than merely a next-door neighbor to Judy and Chuck, but Chuck wanted Judy stranded and completely dependent on him, and it bothered Chuck that Lonnie came to Judy's rescue when he would abuse her. Chuck asked Judy about Lonnie. "Why are you always with Lonnie? And what do you and Lonnie have going?" Quite a bit was going on. Lonnie was constantly engaging in horseplay at Waterause, rubbing the backs and necks of the female employees. As a prank, Lonnie would hide in the shower of the women's bathroom at Waterause, and when one of the women would enter, he would jump out from behind the curtain and scare them. Witnesses said that Judy enjoyed the back rubs that Lonnie was providing. Debbie Doty, in her mid-40s, was another Waterause employee who also worked evenings at the Rivers restaurant. She said she waited on a table where Lonnie and Judy were sitting very close to one another as if they were a couple. Lonnie told David that he needed David's master set of keys for some reason. He took the house key, then claimed he lost it. While David was away on one of his trips, Lonnie performed a striptease at David's home. David was gone on the day of the striptease, and Mariana Raff, David's housekeeper, invited all the women to come to the house. Judy and some other female employees came to the house during the working hours, of course. They trooped over, and apparently Lonnie, who by this time was really acting crazy on drugs, proceeded to perform. Jerry Gray, who was supposed to be in charge, said later she didn't know what her role was at Waterause. David had no idea what was going on. He emphasized that he never would have approved a striptease, but foolishly he felt that if the employees were playful with one another, they were happy, and this was team building and was actually good for employees' morale. So he allowed practical jokes with his tacit approval. However, the practical jokes got out of hand, and Lonnie became the subject of paybacks. For example, in the factory's cafeteria area, the ladies doused Lonnie with soaker squirt guns, put honey on Lonnie's steering wheel, jacking up his car and inserting blocks under the frame so the tires were just above the ground and the vehicle wouldn't go anywhere. Chuck was well aware of the friendship between Lonnie and his wife, but once he found out that more than friendship was involved, Judy pleaded sexual harassment and became a shrieking objector, making a big scene. Chuck stormed into the factory where he got in Lonnie's face with his pointed finger. In a following sexual harassment lawsuit against Lonnie and Waterause, June 10, 2004, Chuck testified that Lonnie Birmingham assaulted him, knocking him to the ground. Lonnie spent 3 days in jail, resulting from a conviction for assault and battery for putting Chuck in a wrestling hold on the floor of the Waterause factory. Judy's case didn't get off the ground because she screwed up by not following the advice of her attorney. She cried wolf too late because she failed to report the sex issue for 2 days. Chuck and Judy quit Waterause and went to work at Jason's Wrecking nearby. Then Chuck filed in federal district court Title VII employment suit against Waterause. A third-party defendant joined Lonnie September the 1st, 2004 because he was the cause of the Cohagen grief, but he defaulted by failing to show up at court. Ultimately, Waterause had to pay thousands to Chuck Cohagen. Surely Chuck had gone to the right attorney, Dennis Albers, in filing yet another suit to help bring down David. All of these lawsuits occurred while David was rotting in jail. During these lawsuits, the government would not allow David to defend himself or his company. Opportunities that orchestra leaders can grasp if there are no moral restraints in their paths are plentiful. Convince a man that you're an honest friend, now you'll know the combination to his safe. Chapter 17, Gunderson and his Conspirators. Things were finally turning around for David. In 1997, he hired Bruce Lesseman to act as the general contractor. Bruce, in turn, hired all the subcontractors to build the first phase of the Water Ice Factory building in Idaho County, while David was still in Las Vegas. He was still active on the radio the following year and was getting quite popular. However, an unfortunate incident occurred. On December the 9th, 1997, Ted L. Gunderson, a retired FBI agent, invited David via telephone to speak on his broadcast, Worldwide Christian Radio, Worldwide Shortwave Radio, Nashville, Tennessee. David or Ted had said that Art Bell, a popular night radio talk show host, was accused of being involved with an underage person. This was not the Art Bell David was referring. David may have spoken out of school, but did publicly apologize for not verifying his misinformation. But Annette Hasselone testified in court that David caused the death of Art Bell. Of course, Bell is alive and well. This is just another lie that the government allowed the jurors to hear. Annette lost credibility with the jurors because of her testimony that David killed Art Bell when they knew Bell is still alive. Yet, Art Bell clarified what had happened. On May the 16th of the year 1997, my son, Art Bell IV, was kidnapped, transported across state lines, and raped by a substitute teacher from his own high school. The assailant was HIV positive. My son was a minor. He was only 16 years old at the time. The teacher involved was tried, convicted, and is now serving a life sentence. Art Bell sued for defamation, but he dropped the charges against David. Bell's son had been a victim. Yet Art Bell had looked guilty in the eyes of many of his listeners, but he did not drop litigation against Gunderson. Ted Gunderson stated in his resume he previously had over 700 persons under his command in the FBI and controlled a $22 million budget. At the time of my retirement, he said, I was one of the top executives, specifically the senior special agent in charge of the Los Angeles division. I had 3 special agents in charge as well as more than 700 personnel under my command. As the senior special agent in charge, it was my responsibility to oversee all the phases of the FBI's investigative jurisdiction throughout most of the Southern California, which encompassed a population of more than 14 million people. I was also responsible for the handling of all administrative matters as well as liaison with other government agencies and the media. One of the most ardent government whistleblowers on the internet is Stu Webb. On Stu's webpage, he voraciously continues to attack Gunderson. He published, "It is now known that Gunderson owed Bobby Eve, a woman in her late 70s, Annette Hasselone, mother-in-law, and Jerry Gray's twin sister, $110,000 that Bobby loaned Gunderson for his 1996 presidential bid. Gunderson stole her monies from the campaign using Jim Keyes, alias Jim Kloberg, another FBI plant. As David's story unfolded, Gunderson's role became extremely suspicious, considering that all the characters Stu mentions were, in fact, the people David had allowed into his life and business. Mr. Webb wrote, Gunderson, Anthony Hilder, Annette Hasselone, J.C. Harding, and Joe Swisher set up a former talk show host and WaterOz.com owner, Dave Hinkson, on a fake murder-for-hire charge in order to steal Hinkson's Water Oz business. An interesting theory is that Gunderson saw a way to pay back Bobby if all went well. Bobby could take over David's growing enterprise. In fact, Bobby did call David, asking to work with David as volunteer, saying her reference was Ted Gunderson. Bobby had an identical twin sister, Jerry Gray, who worked for the Las Vegas Stardust Hotel, and both had been pit bosses. Stu Webb said Bell dropped the suit against Hinkson, but Bell won his suit against Gunderson for slander and defamation of character. Gunderson and others have repeatedly lied and perjured themselves. January 24, 2005, in depositions and testimony in U.S. federal court in Boise, Idaho. This is far from being the end of this case. Hinkson, another patriot American, was set up by fraudster Ted Gunderson and his FBI CIA goons. Webb also said, this has been a pattern of false murder for hire allegations by FBI CIA Gunderson. Ted Gunderson was called before the United States Senate in 1971 and reprimanded for his role in the murder setup of 5 Black Panther members. 2 were acquitted. Panther leader Bobby Seals was falsely accused and spent 2 years in jail before being found innocent of murder. The United States government settled in a lawsuit for several $1 million. This has been a pattern of false murder for hire allegations by FBI CIA Gunderson. Gunderson has a website wherein he attacks the federal government and claims to be a defender of the American citizens. Stu Webb argues that this is merely another FBI hoax to ensnare unsuspecting victims, to entrap them in saying or doing something illegal in order to set them up for prosecution. Ted Gunderson called me after David's trial, trying to assure me that Stu was the undercover FBI agent. I asked Gunderson, "Ted, why would you turn on the FBI to expose their antics?" He said, "Ever since Louis Freeh became director, September the 1st, 1993, through June the 25th, 2001, the Bureau has been corrupt." He praised J. Edgar Hoover and said he had worked closely with Hoover. I told him how highly I had regarded the FBI in the past for honesty and justice. He explained how Stu Webb was a plant and that I should not trust or listen to him. Then he sent me a letter which Stu was purported to have sent to the FBI asking for special treatment because of his services to them. After David's so-called trial, I had spoken on a radio broadcast and made statements about the kangaroo court, and I called Judge Talman a liar. I am cautious about falsely accusing anyone of any wrongdoing without proof. My motivation stems from a religious belief that man will be accountable for his own transgressions. To participate in a lie is dishonorable. The definition of a lie has nothing to do with the factual verification or truth. If one believes something is true and it isn't, he is not lying. In months that followed, Gunderson and others approached me. They were either for or against Stu. My concern was that if Gunderson had a confidential letter sent to the FBI from Stu Webb, how did Gunderson get it? Now that he was out of the FBI and supposedly exposing the FBI fraud, I never learned until later that all the following people emanated from Gunderson's camp: Bobby Eve, Annette Eve Hasselone, Mark Eve, Bobby's son, and Annette's husband, Anthony Hilder, James J.C. Harding, and his girlfriend Annie. These people attached themselves to David big time. David made Bobby his general manager. She said she had access to everything. She brought to Water Oz her son, Mark, and daughter-in-law, Annette. Annette was hiding from California law enforcement while the authorities in Nevada wanted Mark. David allowed Bobby to run the show. He generally worked until 3 a.m. and slept till noon because it was too hot to work during the day. Bobby hired and fired pretty much at will. She hired her daughter-in-law, Annette, a woman without any skills or education, 8th grade education. Hasselone was a fugitive from justice because she had failed to complete probation when she arrived at Water Oz in 1997. California charged her with a felony selling of drugs to minor children in Yolo County, California. When she moved to Idaho County, Idaho, she had no money, no car, nothing. The Las Vegas police wanted Mark, her husband, when he escaped to Idaho. His crime was vehicular assault of a pedestrian in Las Vegas, Nevada. By January of 1998, Water Oz was financially ascending. David said, "In 1998, I worked with Anton Botha of South Africa in testing AIDS patients. We used a new type of zinc and copper therapy that had 100% results. As also, I developed a technique to treat tuberculosis. The clinical studies on AIDS and tuberculosis were done in Swaziland and the Dominican Republic. The first time I ever visited David at his new property in Idaho, Grangeville, and his factory was August 24th, 1998. He held a barbecue for his employees and introduced me to all of them. I didn't know of any intrigue going on. All seemed well. David said that Annette had been dying from a fatal lung infection when she first learned about his products. Supposedly, she became an enthusiastic supporter of Water Oz products. Some parties believe that Gunderson engineered the theft of his own presidential campaign funds. Annette Hasselone had worked in Gunderson's campaign. I have spoken with people who believe that she helped Gunderson steal money from elderly women, hence the affectionate, almost familial-like bond. Apparently, Ted had his sidekick, Anthony Hilder, later send Hilder's girlfriend, Annie Lorraine Bates, born 1976, to recruit J.C. Harding to set up David. Anne's mother, Bonnie Bates, is rearing Annie's son in Sandusky, Ohio. David believes that Gunderson uses Anthony Hilder to perform his dirty work. Regardless, Gunderson admitted that Bobby helped him with his campaign, and he has close personal ties with Bobby's twin sister, Jerry Gray. He calls her Sis. Jerry continued to send free Water Oz products to Ted Gunderson until she left Water Oz after David's imprisonment. Bobby hired her sister, Jerry, to become part of Water Oz. Jerry moved from Las Vegas to Grangeville, about 12 miles from the Water Oz factory. Over time, David grew close to Jerry and considered her as a trusted second mother. Many insiders now believe that Jerry was the spy in the enemy camp. that she helped to orchestrate his downfall, and that she only pretended to be David's oldest and best friend in his business. Total strangers to David, Ann Bates and J.C. Harding first approached him in early December 2002 at the Granada Forum in Los Angeles, where Jerry Gray pressed David to attend. The Forum is a loose-knit public interest group that holds open meetings once a month and draws speakers such as Dave concerning public affairs and alternative healthcare issues. The promoters invited and treated him like a celebrity, wined and dined him. It appears that Gunderson was the man behind the scenes writing the music and pulling the strings. Hilder was the conductor of that orchestration. David explains how they unveiled their way into his life. He said, Annie Bates and James Harding showed up at my factory, January 2003, and spent the night at my home and left the next day. In the morning, Bates came back on the bus because she claimed that she needed to earn some money and wanted to work part-time. I gave her a job. She did not have a car. I loaned her a car to use. She shared an apartment with a man in Boise much of the time during January, February, and March of 2003. She told the roommate she was moving from Arizona and was working at Waterhouse. She left owing $1,000 for her share of the room he rented to her, and she filched some items of personal property he had loaned to her. Next month, the middle of March, Hilder showed up with J.C. Harding. He wanted to park this trailer at our factory, but Jerry Gray told him he couldn't. Later, he parked his trailer at Matthews, David's son's house in Grangeville, in the garage. While he was there were 4 other people in this meeting in my home, in my kitchen. Hilder said that he wanted to make a video about my case. He wanted $10,000 cash to make a documentary film called Prosecutorial Misconduct. I told him that I did not have $10,000 to my name. The reason we were without funds was because our merchant services were cut off after Special IRS Agent Hines stole our credit card information. We continued to ship products and take credit card numbers even though we could not enter the numbers to get paid. We had no account for the credit card. Hilder got very angry. I think that if I had paid him the $10,000, he and Harding were there to accuse me of hiring them to be a hitman. I think that if I had paid him the $10,000, he and Harding were there to accuse me of hiring them to be a hitman. I am sure of this. Hilder was working with Gunderson and FBI agent Long to set me up. He was mad because he did not get this money. What do you do when there's a leak in the cesspool? Chapter 18, Gunderson Plot Revealed. Wes Hoyt received an unexpected phone call from Arlene Jeanette Olson and her husband Will. Wes arranged to meet her in Boise, Idaho at the motel where we were staying. We both talked with her for some length of time at that meeting, April the 8th, 2004. What she told us was shocking. She had been in the employee of Ted Gunderson and overheard a RICO crime in progress. Her affidavit would shatter the prosecution's case and could expose some of the perpetrators. She talked not only about her and her husband's employment and their live-in situation with Gunderson, but she told us about a group picture in Ted's home of which she recognized herself as a child. Ted Gunderson, she said, was a party to a Satan worship ring that her parents had belonged to. In her affidavit, she said, based upon knowledge, information, and belief, Arlene states, the formation of this criminal enterprise can be verified by securing the telephone records of Gunderson, Cook, and Harding, and by comparing the times and dates of phone conversations between them. Also, important questions to be answered. Why would Cook call Gunderson? Why would Harding call Gunderson? What is Gunderson's involvement in the David Hinkson case? Why is Gunderson involved in the Hinkson case? Why is Gunderson talking to a witness in that case and coaching him on what to say? Arlene and her husband were both fearful but agreed to testify at David's solicitation trial. Because of Arlene's knowledge and legal research, Wes hired them, and we housed them for several months. But the middle of the night before they were to testify, they vanished. Since surveillance on every move we made during David's trial was so tight, surely they knew where the Olsons were hibernating. They had also told us before that they were afraid of the government retaliation. Fortunately, we have their affidavit. The affidavit was notarized on March the 29th, 2004, but was sent to us on April the 15th, 2004. Arlene Olson testified as follows. Having first-hand knowledge of the following facts regarding Theodore Lee Gunderson, also known as Ted L. Gunderson, hereinafter Gunderson, I stated the facts as I know and understand them to exist, and I do so to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief that the facts contained herein are true, correct, and certain to the best of my knowledge. And I do affirm this by telling the truth under penalty of perjury pursuant to Title 28 U.S.C. 1746, parenthesis 1, in the matter regarding the events described herein relative to Ted L. Gunderson, located at 750 Royal Crest Circle, apartment 258, Las Vegas, Nevada, 89109, and Nancy Cook of Idaho and J.C. Harding. Okay, I am at the bottom of page 100. We're going to do this in 50-page increments. We'll pick up at the top of page 101 when we next do this. Thank you for your time.